So welcome everybody. This is Fred Schenkelberg, and today's Accendo Reliability webinar is on three kinds of conversations or discussions that I'm sure you've experienced, and I've certainly run into a good set of them. But in general, when we talk about reliability stuff, sometimes we're talking about goals or objectives or whatever we're trying to achieve. And sometimes we run into a problem with just the definition of what we're trying to achieve. Is it a lower failure rate? Well, how do we define failure? If it's a particular field failure performance or field reliability performance, well, to what degree? What is the proportion to be successful and over what duration? Thanks, Nesri. And the goals, objectives, all those kinds of things, and where we're trying to go is often part of our conversations. We also set up plans, right? We either incorporate it into the development plan, or we're working with vendors on how their future products are going to perform in our products, or we're working on a development project or outlining a factory, and we lay out lots and lots of options, and it's always a discussion as to what are the resources, what are the outcomes, who's going to get the results of these different activities, who needs to be involved. We always get the sample size conversation. All kinds of good stuff goes there. And then we also get failures, and failures occur all through the process, and we treat failures in very different ways, but they often are a topic of conversation. And they are a way for us to communicate reliability priorities. All three of these things are just three quick examples of what would spark a conversation of one sort or another. So let me pause there and ask this, hopefully not a rhetorical question, but we'll use the chat window. Are you having predominantly good discussions where it's productive and useful, and it's people are understanding how reliability fits into the group or into the product development or in your situation? Or are they bad conversations? And it's not terribly bad, I'd say. They're asking questions, they're providing a little pushback, they want to understand more, those kinds of things. Or would you say it's ugly conversations? They're just ignoring it, and they don't get it, those kind of things. So use the chat window. Are you in the good, bad, or ugly realm most of the time? This gives me a chance to take a sip of water. Yeah, good, good. All right, thank you, Michael. And Bartholomew, a mix. Yeah, I kind of suspected that would happen. Ugly for the out group, bad in group. Yeah, those that get it, Nelson, tend to get it. And Leon, we'll have to work on that. But it gives you an opportunity when it's in the bad category. We'll sort of that out. Interested but somewhat confused. Good, David. That sounds like you're on a good spot. All right, all right. And well, good. Thanks, everyone. And let's see. So I'm going to start with the good ones, just because that was the order of this rip off of a movie title. But the idea is that these ones we can just reinforce. They're conversations when you hear, hey, David, it's time to update the FMEA. Here's some more information. We need to make sure that happens. And you're being pulled into getting information sorted or accumulated or shared or whatever it is. But it's pulled from the people you're working with in the development team and across the organization. And you've got great conversations going on when the finance team sends their representative to you and says, hey, we need to update the warranty expenses We need the Weibull model for the system that we're getting ready to launch. And it's an indicator that the team is finding value with, say, the modeling or the FMEA or the type of information that you're working with. It's I would say it's a really good thing to have going, but it's one of those that if you don't also capture and reinforce how valuable those activities are, and how natural it is to be part of the development process. And this is why we're doing it. You still need to reinforce those parts of it. As organizations change and priorities change and focus changes, if it's not actually shown why it's so valuable in a regular basis to reinforce what they're already finding out, this can corrode or erode away a little bit. But it's a symptom of when people come to you and say, hey, we need to get together and update the FMEA, we've accomplished some stuff, we need to know what the next set of priorities are, we have new information, that's a really, really good sign. It's a symptom of a good discussion. So hopefully you have a bunch of those. And then another one is where folks are saying, hey, I want to extend the engineering work that we're doing already. We're going to do a SPICE model for our electronic circuits and these critical circuitry piece of this, but they come to you and say, how do we change the parameters such that these are aged parts? We know that resistance drifts, capacitance drifts, different kinds of things change with electronics, and you can incorporate that into SPICE models, finite element with mechanical systems and materials. And so that's a symptom of a really good discussion of what I would say is an area that you're there and you got a good team you're working with when they're coming to you for these nuanced pieces to extend what they're already doing. And so that's a symptom of a good discussion. And another one is when the customers notice, right? I had one organization years ago making laptops, and this was early on in laptops, and they wanted to position their laptops as the best reliability among the laptop options. At that point, Dell had great customer service because their laptops failed like everybody else's did, but they actually made that a benefit. And somebody else had the lowest price. And so these guys wanted to be the most reliable. And the question was, well, how much more reliable do we need to be in order for customers to recognize it? Well, that's a good question. It's not one I was prepared to answer, but we went and talked to a variety of folks in their marketing group and got some rough targets. And then it was limited by the technology that was available. But at some point, they started to recognize this is the most reliable product and in the market. And that was the driver for the growth of their sales over time. But it was a deliberate request or discussion about, well, how good does it need to be? And that was a great discussion, even though the product at the time, early laptops were dismal field reliability. But they recognized that there was an opportunity there in order to build reliability very deliberately into the product, but connected to the growth of their market share, to the growth of the perception. And they had to make it real, not just the advertising campaign, but they actually had to make products that were more reliable than the other ones. And so we did a bunch of work with them to sort that out. But those are all three really good ideas to do this. But the question here is, though, well, how do you encourage people to have good discussions, right? So those are examples of them. And I mentioned that on the first one is that you need to reinforce it to say, this is updating the FMEA, and I'm glad you asked to do this, but this is why it's valuable, or this is how the results of what we're doing really makes a difference. The three things we solved and reduced their RPNs over the last month, those equate to X number of dollars of avoided field failures. and the costs associated with it. So how do you encourage good discussions? Let's see. Yeah, problem definition, right? Good. Yeah, good one, Nelson. Yeah, is being able to listen to say, let's sort this out and let's sort out what problem we're trying to solve, make sure we're in the right direction. Yeah, I would, Mihendra, I would also look at sharing examples of previous successes and how useful those were. So it works both ways. You can say, hey, this is great work because we're avoiding these past problems, like a delay of product launch and all of its associated costs. Or, this kind of activity helps us to actually launch on time. Look at how valuable that is. Yeah. Yeah, talk to customers. It takes some trust on the marketing and sales team to let us do that, but it's often very, very valuable. Yeah, good. All good. Thanks, Larry. Feedback to the designers, and it's feedback that it has to be of value to the team you're working with, right? It might be cost reduction, it might be time to market, it might be feature set. In some organizations, they actually care about reliability and they want to know how well that what they're doing makes a difference. And those are all good things. Part of it is to be willing to have these discussions and support them, but also to reinforce them. So that's the basic message, which is the good stuff. Now, I didn't want to talk about all the good discussions all the time. So let's talk about some of the ones that give you an opportunity to make a difference within the discussion and to change things. These are ones that I noticed, and when I asked it earlier, are a good swath of you run into ones I put into this group. Now, we often get resistance. You want how many samples? You want to do this, you want to do that. What do we need a goal for? We just need to make it as good as or better than last time. We know what we're doing. We don't need no root cause. I know what the problem is. Let's go solve it. Right? We hear stuff like that all the time. Now, these are more subtle to change. Now, part of it is I think it was where was it? One of the comments was, remember past failures or past successes. And this part, you do need to do some data. So let's just look at root cause here, for example. And I'm sure every one of you has been in a room where it's a big field problem. You got a team together to help you solve it. First step is, well, what is the problem? What is the symptoms that you're getting? And somebody says, oh, I know exactly what that is. We don't need to have a meeting. I'm going to go change it and we'll be fine. And then 2 weeks later, you're back in the room trying to solve the same problem. We don't, the other part of that is we don't have time to talk about this. We need to just go take action. And there's a lot of resistance to actually understanding a failure before you go solve it. But the idea here is that in a failure reporting and corrective action system or a FRACIS system or something similar, is take a look at the different, take notes as to which ones were a team effort and you actually got to a root cause. And root cause meaning you can turn it on and off. You have enough understanding of the phenomena that you can say, oh, if we make this a cold solder joint and give it some vibration, it will fail. Or if we do X, it'll cause this failure to manifest. If we do change it slightly or do it, then it doesn't occur. We probably have a good understanding of the root cause to that level. It doesn't have to be, a PhD level thesis study of understanding, but it needs to be enough that you can understand exactly what you need to change such that it connects to that failure occurring or not occurring. Now, of course, it's way more complicated than that. In some cases, sometimes it's pretty easy. But the idea is keep track of which ones had a good understanding of the root cause versus ones where we just tried something, and which has the better success rate. Now, intuitively, we know that if we understand the problem, we have a better success rate. But even just shooting from the hip, we often can solve problems, but at what rate? And if you have a handful of experienced engineers and they're really good at that, well, then you might have evidence that that's the way to do it. Until they don't. Understanding the root cause of issues gives you, in my opinion and my experience, a much higher probability of actually solving the problem. Now, nobody likes it when you say, I told you so. But if you take track of the data and just show, here's the first time success rate is solving problems when we do root cause analysis versus when we don't, there's data, there's evidence there. And it's not blaming anybody, it's not pointing the fingers at anybody, but it gives you evidence that says there's a better way to do this. And that's where I think these kinds of discussions have to really focus on the process works, whichever process it is, but it allows us to make better decisions. It allows us to solve it right the first time. The idea of breaking prototypes is, and I think I have another slide that's going to talk about this, but the idea is that we want to learn something. If we're doing HALT, yes, we're planning on breaking these things. You can have as many samples as you want as long as we can sell them. It's not the same idea as learning something for how do they fail? What kinds of stresses cause problems that are of concern, are likely to occur in the field or manifest as field problems? So the basic idea here is that with these kinds of pushback and stuff, and we often run into these things, is being prepared. Here's the value of learning how things fail so that we can get to the root cause and actually design it out of the product. If we just run tests to success, we have no failures. And now we don't know if it's got any margin, if it's process variability is going to be a problem, if, whatever, if what's going to cause problems in the field. And the cost of finding out when it's in the field is way larger and disruptive to our process of creating the next product, because half our team has to go solve previously or failure mechanisms that we should have solved during the design. But again, it's one of those where I bite my tongue and say, I'm not going to tell you I told you so. But here's the logic. If we break things now, we can understand how it fails, and we can make conscious decisions to improve it or not, as opposed to waiting for failures to appear late in the program, we delay it, or in the field, and now it's an emergency, and the associated cost. So at some point, you're going to say, pay me now or pay me later, but please don't use those words. Most program managers don't appreciate that. But it's focusing on what's important to them. Is it development cost? Is it time to market? Is it what? But then look at having each of these different things and all the different things that we get pushback on with a clear connection to where it makes sense, how it adds value to our program and to helping them make better decisions. Now, all of you have had bad discussions with vendors. I remember years and years ago, I had a product came back from the field. It had a circuit board that was failed. There was no obvious corrosion or missing parts or cold solder joints. It was within a ASIC. And so I called up the vendor and they say, oh, I know what that is. That's ESD damage. Somebody touched it with too much charge on their body and zapped it. I said, you don't even know what product I'm talking about or what component I'm talking about. How do you know it's ESD? He goes, oh, it always is. Well, if you assume it always is, then it always is. And so I complained to a colleague of mine, and he said, well, that's just one of the 5 common responses. It's like, well, it's ESD. And it just went on from there. It was like, oh, let's see, it could be, you send the product back or the component back to them and they say, no trouble found, works fine for us. Must be your system. Oh, it's customer abuse. You guys didn't design it correctly. Oh, it was, oh, we knew about it, but we solved it already. Or some of the common vendor responses to it's not our fault. Say, it's your fault. The discussions I get from vendors, when you do have a failure, are often not all that useful. So I often advertise or recommend do your own failure analysis. Don't send it to the vendor unless you have to. But other things show up is in conversations that we have within our organization is, well, they gave us an MTBF number. That's good enough. Let's just use that. And, you've all heard my stories about that, but the idea is that it's a fan. Bearings wear out. It's not a constant failure rate. How are we going to deal with this? It's not repairable. It's all these other things. How are we going to estimate this with this bogus data? So asking better questions is part of it. But within your own team, it's helping them understand that not all data from the vendor is good data, and teach them the opportunity to say, well, how is it going to fail in our circumstance? How do you know it's going to fail? And what's your evidence? Those kinds of questions lead to a much more fruitful discussion with the vendor rather than just saying, oh, the data sheet says it'll last 5 years. Well, what proportion are going to last 5 years? It's an opportunity to tweak those conversations such that you do get better information from your vendors, because we're not just simply satisfied with their first response. The other one I love is the vendors know their product the best. And that may be true in their assembly of that product. But I was working with a inductor manufacturer. And these are discrete little components with a magnet or a piece of metal with some coil wrapped around it. And sometimes these coils are hand wrapped. Oftentimes they are. And the vendor got really good at producing the specific amount of inductance within a specified form factor. They were good at what they did. But I asked them, says, how do you know how to evaluate your product for where it's going to be used? And he goes, we have no idea where it's going to be used. They're in computers, they're in satellites, they're undersea, they're on the coast, they're at high altitude, they're everywhere. There's no way we know where the bulk of our products are used. We lose because they sell them to assembly houses that assemble the circuit boards, and they rarely know what product it's even going on. And because it's considered a commodity component. And so if we're using a component that we're using it in a unique environment, that's a different discussion than just saying, oh, they know what they're doing, because they may well not have much information or desire to know. Now, some of them will heartily join that conversation if you're willing to share how you're using their product and will it work or not work. But just default trusting them that they know what they're doing may or may not be applicable. I think I actually got that word close to being pronounced right, is to work in your circumstance. And so discussions with vendors, I find sometimes are overly influenced by how good of a lunch they provide. And we got to get into the technical details and train and work with our team to effectively work with vendors to get the reliability information we really need to use. And then there's the discussions that we get where it's, oh, it's just another, we've gotten 5 failures and it didn't boot up, so it must be the power supply. And we didn't even look to see if there was anything wrong with the power supply or not. All right. It could be many, many things that are part of the issue. Or in many organizations, this no fault found or no trouble found is like 25% of your field returns. I've seen that at organization after organization, but Why are so many customers sending us back good products? Now, it could be that it's the wrong color, or it doesn't have the feature set that it was expected to have, or we're not actually evaluating it well enough to understand how it's failed. In their circumstance, they find it's failed or doesn't meet their needs. What about our return process and analysis of it to determine whether that's effective or that's actually nothing wrong with the product or not? And I'm sure you've run into taking a vehicle into your auto mechanic and, there's a squeaky sound in the back, and they call you 3 hours later saying, we can't find that. There's nothing wrong with this. Now, sometimes it's just the environment. You only hear it in a quiet day when you're next to a fence, for example. Well, up on a rack, they have lots of other noise going on, so they don't have that ability to hear it. It may cost them a bunch more to figure out how to replicate the sound that you're doing. If we shortchange that process of figuring out how things work, then that's a problem, right? So these kinds of pushback or symptoms, I should say, parts of the discussion we have is the status quo, the way we just do business is not actually useful, right? It's not leading us to making better decisions or learning stuff about what's happening with customers in the field. The other two I mentioned here are, this will go away. It's just a test, and we don't really pay attention to the results of the test, but we'll add it to the checklist. And so whatever, you need another $200 to run that test. Okay, fine. But I don't really care about the results. That's an opportunity to take a look at whether it's testing, or say that you're introducing the team to derating or stress strength calculations. It's, why does that make difference? What's the information out of this test or out of this procedure actually do to create value? How does it actually help you do your job better? Those kinds of things. What's in it for them is often a part of these things. If we spend more time understanding field failures, we'll have a better customer satisfaction. It would be one argument, but how do you connect those? That's a difficult part. So there's a handful of bad discussions. What other examples can you think of? Right? What other bad discussions have you run into? I just highlighted, I don't know, 5 or 6 of them there. And then more importantly, what do you do about it? No trouble found. Yeah, I never heard of WEEP before, Larry. That's a good one. So what do you think? What's some of your favorite resistance type discussions or pushing back on you? Pass the gross test, so it's ready to ship. Yep. Okay. We don't have time for that. Yeah, Michael, that's a common one. And all right, do you have time to fix it later? It's kind of my pushback a lot of times. That doesn't go very far a lot of times. We have other priorities. Tiger team voted to fix. Yeah, don't go asking for verification, Larry. That's adding time again. Too late to make changes. Yeah, Mahindra, I've heard that one before too. And sometimes that's valid. If you're late in the program and it's going to cost you $100,000 of delay due to delay or do whatever, and if the problem gets to the field, it's only cost you $10,000. Well, then economically, it makes sense to ship it and pay for it later. But sometimes that's absolutely reversed. It might be a $10,000 fix, and it'll save you $100,000 in the early shipments. You got to work out the details of what's the business proposition. Oh, it's only a theoretical spec. So we don't have to make it. Is that what you're saying, David? As they say, that's just we we don't have to pay attention to it because it's just theoretical. That's a good one. Yeah, we do preventative maintenance. Yeah. So the maintenance, the techs will keep it running. We don't have to design it well. Yeah, right. Yeah, good, good. All good ones. Only saw it once. Oh, that's a good one, Bartholomew. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard this story. There is a San Diego division of HP that at one point hired an intern to take a look at the field returns they were getting for a product that had been out in the field for a year or so, and look at the internal database of what they noticed during the development process. The product took about a year to develop, and they had a FRACIS system. It kept track of issues and things they found, and then they triaged them, and they worked off the important ones, safety ones, stuff like that, and kind of worked down the list. And the question to the intern was, they asked her, if we would have spent another month, given the rate that we were solving these problems that we are identified, how many more problems would we have solved that would have showed up in the field? Basically, if we would have worked on solving more issues for 30 more days, how many field problems would we have avoided? And that was a brilliant project. I wish they would have published it. But she found out that there was about a 95% overlap of issues found in the field where issues that they had seen during development. And it was like 85-ish% of those things would have been addressed if they would have spent one more month on it. And it's a hard thing to do when you're in all these things are moving, and you got to get out to the manufacturing ramped up and get to production and hit the shelves at certain times, and advertising, all these other factors of it. But it was one of those things that when they tallied up the numbers, it would have saved them millions of dollars if they would have spent one more month getting the product a bit more reliable. And of course, these were all issues that weren't showstoppers. These were all minor defects that most people said, we only saw that once, or it's not a big deal, or it'll never go. But there was no perceived time for research of how important that was. But when you start making millions of products, even something you see only once in development, it can well be a 5 or 10% defect rate in the field. And so the study reinforced for them to go deeper down that list, go into those areas where it's single appearance or it's considered a minor defect or those kind of things, because they make a huge difference, especially in volume products, once you get to the field. And so that was one that I saw. Let's see some of these other ones. Too late. Yeah. All good ones. The hard part here is, and is like I mentioned earlier, is not saying I told you so, but it's, if we solve this, this will make this difference. If we fix this, it'll make this difference. If we get better data, we'll make better decisions. Here's the evidence of how these things change. Now, you might not win all of those discussions, and it's not a win or not win. And a lot of times it's really just an awareness that what we're doing now and the way we do business and the way we're making priorities and decisions is not serving our customers and our business. And making those connections obvious without blaming anybody, but looking at the structure of the organization that forces people to say, oh, yeah, I like this one, but it's just a prototype. That'll never happen. Well, if you can tie it to that. My other favorite is the software guys were complaining that the hardware kept failing, so they couldn't do their job, but they never actually reported the hardware failures to anybody because that's not their job. There's another one. But anyway, each one of these discussions is a point to say, well, this is why it's important. This is how our process is forcing us to make these poor decisions, and here's the consequence of those things. And it could take the form of many different things. And you're feeling, hopefully you're seeing this thread of connecting it to value to your organization, whichever source of value makes sense for your particular circumstance. And that's a part of it. All right, well, let's dive into a couple of the ugly ones, right? The ugly decisions, the ones that you know you're in big trouble if these discussions are happening, right? One of my favorites was somebody said, well, we only expect this product to work for 2 years, but we've got a 50,000 hour MTBF, which is 5 years roughly of usage time for our product. So it must be good. And how I feel about MTBF and MTTF. Others I've heard say, well, of course we use these MT values because that's what our industry uses. Okay. And you're experiencing a 30% field rate problem. And one of them was from an actual client. And I said, well, what's your goal of your product? And it was a big, complex product. Think supercomputer style product. And they said, we want no more than one downing event per quarter. Okay, we can work with that. Let's translate that. And they said they wanted it expressed as MTBF. All right. 4 events out of 8,000 hours. What's that? 2,000 hour MTBF, something like that off the top of my head. Somebody could do the calculation faster than I can, which sounds great. Right. And I said, well, what is that when we put it into simple exponential distribution? Just a rough guess of this, and it was like 20, 30%, something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers we were using, and he said, well, we can't set a goal of 30% reliable per year because that doesn't sound good. Well, it's no different than saying you have a 2,000 hour MTBF, kind of thing. And so the discussion was the perception of what sounded better or what the industry always did or whatever. It wasn't connected at all to how does it help them make better decisions or how does it reinforce a clearer picture of the reality that they're dealing with. Yeah, fear of job reduction. I don't know that anybody I've ever met has lost their position because their product was too reliable. We often joke or even talk about is we should be working our way out of a job. It should be part of the reliability thinking should be embedded within the organization. And that it just frees us up. If our product is actually working, we can actually spend a lot of quality time actually making more significant improvements in the overall production or the development process itself. As opposed to firefighting all the time. There's, the reliability maturity matrix when you're proactive has so many more benefits, although it's not as visible as being the hero that saved the day kind of thing. And one of my favorite discussions is, well, we're only designing this so it works in the flat part of the bathtub curve, and using that mistaken belief that there is a flat part. And it's like, all right, what evidence do you have that it's true? One of them I was working with, it was a defense contractor. And they said, well, we've never, ever had any components or any systems that exhibited anything except constant failure rate. I says, really? And I knew they had fans and elements that wore out and all kinds of other things like that. And then I know that they had early life failures for all kinds of manufacturing problems. I says, really, what evidence do you have for that? And he goes, well, when we do data analysis, we just assume it's in the flat part of the curve because that's the only part we're interested in. So we assume it's a constant failure rate. Therefore, they all are constant failure rates in all of our analysis. Okay. I don't know how to come back from that one. I just got up and left. It was like, that's just not worth talking to you anymore. Luckily, they'd already paid me for my time. But the idea is that some of the concepts and beliefs that are out in the reliability engineering world and literature are just so wrong and so pervasive that they've just grounded people in a world that it's very difficult to get them out of. And it does take time. And so it's this notion that, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yet they also have broken their feedback mechanism to understand how bad their situation actually is. Well, that was just like the earlier one. Well, that was a prototype. We don't need to pay attention to those failures. Those kinds of things. So this is, as you know, I could talk about this topic for a long, long time, but I'll spare you that. Let's see. Yeah, I like yours, Nelson, on the vendor one. Is we'll take care of it, and then you hear nothing, and nothing really makes a difference. It reinforces my notion that if it's important to you, do your own failure analysis or hire a local lab to do it for you. You invest in getting the right answer. And then you have evidence. You can go to the vendor and saying, hey, you're not applying enough adhesive to this component, and that's why it's coming apart. Let's get into your process and understand why this is occurring. We actually bring them useful information and saying, hey, we need to fix this, not to blame them or do anything else, although sometimes that does occur. So let's take another one here. I actually had a general manager when we were doing a assessment of their organization. He asked, so why are we here? Why are we talking about reliability? That's, it's not a problem for us. And I said, even though you're only tracking the cost of spare parts, not the labor, not the replacement costs, not the customer complaints, not the call centers, not your field service team, reinstalling a component that is brand new for the one that just failed. Those costs are in the millions, and you're not tracking them as failures. You're counting spare parts for tens of thousands of dollars. And he goes, exactly, it's not a problem. And I said, half of your products fail every year. And he says, well, no, they don't. Customers just like complaining. That's what they do. Customers complain. And it says they've never, this hospital administrator has never called you to say, why is your product not working? Says, well, they just like complaining. That's what they do. And he brushed it off. He just said, that's not an issue. Well, that's the tip of a much larger story, but eventually we made some significant changes there. So that found somebody that actually paid attention to customers and what they needed for this product to actually do, and do it over time successfully. But you've all run into these where the biggest Pareto on your field returns is, well, that's customer abuse. We don't need to solve those. Well, if 60% of your products are coming back because you're calling it customer abuse, that's probably not a good symptom to ignore. You probably need to really do something about that. One, find better customers, maybe, or create a product that they can't abuse as readily, or maybe they're using it in a way that's a new product idea. There might be something else there altogether. I know some of you have heard the story about the barcode reader for baggage handlers at airports. Their first product that went out to do this feature, this company that I know about, realized that these folks were likely to drop this device, this electronic wireless barcode scanner. And so they put it in one of those shells to absorb shocks and stuff like that. And all of them came back in a couple of weeks. They got way more drops. And their first attempt at this was look at standards. And they said, well, if you drop it 10 times from 3 feet onto concrete and it passes that, you're fine. Well, any casual observer at an airport will realize that 3 feet is too low, and 10 times is too low if you want your product to last more than a week or two. And so they changed their standard. They said, all right, designers, we need to go from 10 feet, I think they eventually got to 22 feet and over 100 drops before they got the field problem low enough that it wasn't a big problem for them anymore. Their products just basically just worked and typically failed for other issues, not just the shock damage. And so the idea of just blaming the customer is convenient and not all that helpful. And that's a hard one to break out of. And you're right, Bartholomew, considering expected misuse is standard practice in some industries, especially when it comes to safety or patient health or patient safety. It's often part of a good FMEA process that allows us then to anticipate the types and range of stresses that the product's likely to experience. And so the hard part here is that when you start blaming the customer, or you start blaming a vendor, or you start blaming well, the design team didn't have enough funding, and now they're all working on the next product, but also spending half their time fixing the previous one. So this new product just won't have enough time to be designed correctly. And then just blaming that we're in a vicious cycle, we can't get out of it. Those are all things that are symptoms that we've got a structural problem and maybe even an attitude problem. And it does take some connecting these things to, well, how much is this really costing us? Or what is the ramifications if this process continues? Those are elements of it. Oh, why 22 feet, Kent? Good question. That was the height of the room they could get their ramp to go up to. They had a little system that would take the product up to the top and it would get released, and then it would drop onto their surface, onto their concrete pad they had. Short of adding an extension to the roof, 22 feet was what they could do. And so they just then increased the number of drops in order to do it. They did think about accelerating it using it like an air gun kind of thing to get it up to velocity for a higher problem. But they found that, and it took them a number of years to go from 3 feet to 6 feet to 12 feet. Then they jumped to like 40 feet, or not 40 feet to 20 feet, or the 22-foot one. And then they started increasing the number of drops. And they were doing that along the lines of this, but each time they up the ante on it, they looked at the field returns and they found there's a direct correlation between the two. The more robust that we make the drop test to call it a pass, the lower the warranty. And so that encouraged them to go to the limit that they could find. And it then got that warranty rate for drop related failures down to less than 0.5%, whereas before it was near 100% in a very short period of time. And so once they saw that correlation, then they really just focused on that test and used it for a major input into their design process. There was one way to go at it. Okay, let's see. Another favorite of mine is that failures are bad. We often, and I ran into a colleague years ago that says, you have to understand the management team and the product managers and the development team, they're all trying to make it work, right? They're in success space. They want it, this product, when you push this button, this green light will come on, kind of things. They want it to work. They're creating prototypes to see what works as much as they're looking for how to make improvements, but they're generally focused on make it work. Now, Henry Petrosky in his work posits that good designers design away from failure. So having information about where the margins are and where failures do occur is useful information for good designers. But in some organizations, it's just not safe to say, hey, this isn't working. Right? It's seen as, well, you notice it, you fix it, or you noticed it, you must have broke it. What did you do? It turns into blame. Well, I'm not going to tell you about anything I see anymore because you're just going to blame me for it. Well, it's not helpful to anybody. Others are, and I've run into this with a major chip manufacturer. they said, well, we only run industry standard tests and we only report things that's pass. So how many times did you do this temperature humidity test? We had to do that 6 times before we got one that passed. Okay. What did you do with the ones that failed? Well, they must have been bad batches. So we're not using those. We're only using the one that passed. Did you make any design improvements or process changes? No. Those are bad tests. Okay. Sigh. The idea of a culture that thinks failures are bad is missing the information that comes from that. They're missing the opportunity to actually understand it and make improvements. And I think I'm preaching to the choir here on that one. But the idea is that there are some organizations say, don't bring me failures, bring me solutions. Right? Don't talk about failures. We don't need to track failures. We don't have customer service tracking of customer complaints. Those are failures. We don't need to deal with it. We're success oriented. I've actually run into organizations like that. And they were just ignoring the issues that they were creating. And it doesn't make them go away, right? It doesn't change anything. The reality is if your product doesn't work, the customers are going to vote with their dollars at one point or another in that scenario. So what other, types of discussions, good, bad, or ugly, have you had? Other ugly ones? I again just touch the realm of these. And the ugly ones are the hardest ones, in my opinion, to change. They take a bit of more patience than I typically have, but they also take a lot of awareness of what's that cycle or process and where does it lead? What's the natural result of these kinds of ugly discussions and where does that lead to an organization? And I worked with one organization. They refused to have prototypes. Every item they ever made, they shipped. Even though it was a brand new high-tech design, they would repair it enough times that they would ship it. And their attitude was, well, the contract is for 10 units and they're paying us for 10 units. So we're not going to make an 11th unit as a prototype. We're going to sell all 10. We're only going to buy 10 sets of components. And that was just, and they were wondering why vast majority of their products failed over and over again. Bartholomew, when I worked at HP, we often ran into the idea of it's not a failure, it's an opportunity, or it's, we kind of rephrased it as it's not a problem, it's a chance to make improvement or something like that. Sometimes the wording we use does make a difference. But I also run into, it's not a requirement, so I'm just going to ignore it. And we'll leave that to the next team to do. Now, sometimes that makes sense, but it's also, if it's used as a convenient way to avoid taking on a challenge or fixing a problem that's really going to be a significant problem in the field or pushed down the road, well, then that's pretty bad business. Yeah. Talk about, right? We don't have time to talk about reliability. We just got to get this prototype to work first. And then when it's a new invention or a new concept or something like that, yeah, if they get one to work, then we have a plan of record and we can start working on it. But I stay involved with, well, what are the issues you are seeing? What are the trade-offs you're making? Which kinds of failures are you experiencing that makes you think it's not working? Because those will continue to be there in one form or another, oftentimes as that program develops. So it's a good place to, all right, you guys do your magic there, but I'm going to take notes because these things will come back. Oh, wow. More in the field fixing things than designers. Yeah, and I've often asked the directors of engineering, what proportion of your staff is working on past problems versus on the new stuff? And it's typically 25%. It can be worse, as you just illustrated, Larry, but it also well managed in a good organization, it can be much, much less. Let's see. Yeah. Yeah, we can't just decree it. Good one, Michael. It really is, it's an opportunity to make improvements. And I oftentimes you need a handful of champions to get enough momentum behind those kinds of discussions to change the culture of how we look at failures, or how we um, assign blame versus looking for process improvements, those kinds of things. It takes somebody that's willing to support, we need to look at this in a different way. And that level of change in an organization is not one to take on alone. You need lots of champions on your side and lots of senior management cover to really be successful with that. Yeah, adds workload. You know, and Mahendra, that I hear you on that one. And what the hard part is, you know, pay me now or pay me later. And there's saying, well, if we're spending 25% of our time fixing past problems, we don't have time to design it right. Now it's a vicious circle, right? And so it's, how do we help them recognize that? I oftentimes would show that ad from a Super Bowl years ago, if they were making the or manufacturing the airplane while it was in flight, and they got it all buttoned up and all the seats in place and the windows attached and the rivets on the wings, and then the crew parachuted off, and the passengers and the flight attendants and the pilots, you know, kept on flying, and, you know, job well done kind of thing. Sometimes it feels like that when you're trying to make structural changes to an organization, and let's get the design right. That's where you really need the support to have enough resources, time, and focus to actually get it right, and then see what the benefits are. And the hard part, a lot of what we do is it takes time for the results to appear. But making it clear, making it connected to, this is why we do these activities in design, like FMEA and so on, so that we don't spend half of our next year solving problems that we should have fixed. And that is often very hard to see when you're in an organization that's focused on the next quarter, for example. So let's see if I missed any here. Yeah, good quote. Let's see. So anyway, I think I got one more question for you. So my intent here was to say there's different kinds of conversations that occur. And as a couple of you mentioned, there's a mix. We see a range of these different ones, depending on who we're talking to and when and under what circumstance. But the idea is to recognize those. The good discussions need reinforcement, right? We need to make sure that those remain valuable so that they are talked about, that we continue to do the activities that actually help us make a reliable product. And one way that I know of to do that is to reinforce how useful and valuable those activities are. That is why we don't go off and fix field problems all the time. That's why we have a low warranty rate. Those are not happenstance. That's because the team is actually talking about and implementing reliability into the design process. The bad discussions, as I loosely characterized them, are opportunities to fill in some gaps and to improve the type of information and resources that are available to help them understand the connection of, yeah, we need to break prototypes and learn from them. Of course, it's more of answering the why questions. Why are we doing this? What's the connection? How does this benefit me or you or the customer? How does this work? Some of it can be solved with training, some of it by helping them understand how it actually does make their job easier. Now, the ugly discussions are more structural and more mindset, and that takes a lot more effort to change. Yet I found that chipping away at it and reinforcing what is it the organization is there to do and how the current structure and atmosphere is leading to very poor performance in what we're trying to achieve. But it also requires, you need some champions, you need some support, you need a handful of influential people that also recognize that what we're doing now is not going to work long term. And that may or may not occur. If you can't find enough support, then it's probably, time to go find another organization. But if the culture is toxic and it's a blame game and they really don't see that any need to change that atmosphere, well, there's not a lot we can, as individuals, can do about it. It can be done. It takes being very astute and developing those champions for you, but it does take work. So that's the big challenge. So hopefully you don't see too many of those. Hopefully those bad discussions are recognized as opportunities to really hone and polish the system and the process so that you can bring along more people into understanding that reliability doesn't just happen by magic. It happens because they make good decisions and you're there to support that and to help them to do that. And so that's hopefully you see a few of those and you convert more of them into good discussions. And that would be a fine output or a outcome for this short discussion on the topic. Yeah, providing, providing education, logic trail, good examples, how it impacts. I've had companies say, well, we need it to be unreliable because that's how we make money. Well, that's a hard argument because they make money on repairs. And that's a hard argument to overcome. So it's risky to go to the customers and say, this is what the game they're playing here. This is, be a whistleblower. But sometimes that might be what it takes. Not that I'm recommending it. That's a personal decision. All right. Well, thank you, Bartholomew. And let's pull up our last slide. I might actually end right on time. Amazing how that happens. So thanks for all the input and examples and so on. As I suspected, there's many examples of good, bad, and ugly discussions out there. Hopefully you picked up a couple of ideas of one, how to recognize them and how to turn them, to reinforce them or convert them into good discussions. So with that, I'll say best of luck to you. Let me know how it goes, what successes or not you have, and we'll see with that how it goes from there. All right, thanks all. And let your friends know, we're going to have a recording up in a couple of days up on Accendo Reliability. And next week, we have an open discussion session at this time on Tuesday. So bring your questions and you can, and then the week after that is Chris Jackson, and he's got something he's going to be talking about root cause analysis. And I don't remember exactly what the thread was, but it's why do we need root cause analysis or something along that lines. So great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. We'll talk to you next week or soon thereafter.